Welcome. It's my very great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Jane Bennett, Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. But before I do, I have a few other introductions to make, since this is the first opportunity this year for the Material and Visual World's transdisciplinary area of excellence to introduce itself to those of you who weren't able to participate in its events last year, and especially to welcome new faculty appointed last year as faculty with an affiliation with the Material and Visual World's TAE. We are really delighted to have been joined by Alexandra Kessler in cinema, Carl Gelderloos in German, Brendan Hennessy in Romance Languages, Jeffrey Kirkwood, Art History, and Alison Robinson in Classics and Near Eastern Studies. And we couldn't be more pleased to have you all here. Beyond this rare opportunity for the TAE to foster an intellectual community and innovative scholarship through affiliated hires, this speaker series and the graduate student and faculty working group that meets together and with each of our guest speakers to discuss in a workshop setting work in progress has become the foundational project of this TAE. In this context, we have gathered together people and ideas to engage an increasingly vibrant constellation of intellectual approaches that have come to reorient the familiar intellectual preoccupation in the humanities and social sciences with issues of representation, interpretation, and human agency toward questions concerning materiality, immanence, and effective registers. A reorientation that has widely been glossed as a turn from epistemology to ontology. This displacement of the apparently inevitable centrality of human agency in the determinations of language has served as an invitation to consider the effective character of the material worlds in which we are enmeshed, and has opened a space for scholars from a wide variety of disciplines to approach things, persons, and images as gatherings of technologies, materials, histories, and interactions extending through space and time, the boundaries of which are, within this purview, much less settled than might have been expected. Professor Bennett's scholarship has been central to this emergent intellectual project, provoked in the first instance, as it has been recounted, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, by undergraduate studies in environmental science that opened up questions about how we might think and think differently about relationships between people and nature. This is the interest that she pursued in her doctorate in political science from the University of Massachusetts and in a formidable series of books, Unthinking Faith and Enlightenment, Nature and the State in a Post-Hegelian Era, published in 1987, Thoreau's Nature, Ethics, Politics and the Wild, as part of the Modernity and Political Thought series published by Sage in 1994, The Enchantment of Modern Life, Attachments, Crossings and Ethics, a Princeton publication in 2001, and most recently, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, Duke University Press, 2010. She is the author of articles and book chapters, too numerous to name, and the co-editor of 2 collected volumes. Professor Bennett is currently editor of Political Theory, an international journal of political philosophy, and just a summer ago, she was in our neighborhood teaching in Cornell's Summer School for Criticism and Theory, a seminar on eco-materialism, in which she explored the central question that has animated her career, and I'm quoting her. What would the world look and feel like were the life-matter binary to fall into disuse, were it to be translated into differences in degree rather than kind? Please join me in welcoming Professor Jane Bennett.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. Some from as far away as Alexandria, Virginia, but that would be my mom. And some childhood friend from Poughkeepsie. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Pamela Smart and Bridget Murphy for making my visit so smooth so far. Okay, I want to talk first about public anxiety. That's the first section, called public anxiety. In 2009, the UK government proposed austerity cuts in public spending, a steep rise in university fees, a pro-business remodeling of labor and environmental policy, and tax breaks for the rich. This plan for the neoliberalization of Britain, like those elsewhere, generated a variety of neo-Keynesian responses. It also faced opposition from a group called the Institute for Precarious Consciousness, a coalition of activists, quote, committed to ongoing experimentation to find the forms of collective activity needed to build a world beyond capitalism, end quote. The group sought to craft a radical political agenda that was neither neoliberal nor Keynesian, nor, for reasons that I'll note below, dependent upon a naked call for revolution. Their manifesto, called 6 Theses on Anxiety, and why it is effectively preventing militancy, names as one important obstacle to their agenda a depoliticizing anxiety circulating in the population. The left, they say, needs to start building a better machine for fighting anxiety. And I would like to take up that call, and I'll be using Walt Whitman to help me. Before I turn to Whitman, I think a bit more needs to be said about the particular critique in which a concern with anxiety is placed alongside the more familiar focus on economic inequality. So 6 Theses highlights how capitalism, in addition to sort of enlisting ideology, the police, law, also works at the level of affect in order to foster acquiescence to its unequal distribution of social and economic costs and benefits. Indeed, each wave of capitalism, they say, is said to have cultivated a different emotion or mood, each of which works to personalize and depoliticize the experience of structural harms. In the 19th century, they say, it was the feeling of misery that performed this task. An immiserated proletariat was encouraged to take its exhaustion as a biological given rather than a political effect. Those who saw through this fought back with tactics such as strikes, party organization, mutual aid societies, and all of these were targeted against misery. But by the middle of the 20th century, according to the 6 Theses, the affective landscape is depicted as having changed. Now it is boredom that becomes the prominent mood of capitalist culture. Fordist workers in deadening jobs, paper pushers in cubicles, and housewives in the suburbs are encouraged to take their boredom as a necessary cost of economic security. Now, tactics during this wave of capitalism, they say, were aimed at disrupting what the Institute calls the work, consume, die cycle. So we might think here of tactics such as those from the Situationists, practices like the dérive, feminist consciousness raising in books like Our Bodies, Ourselves, Herbert Marcuse's quest to replace a society governed by the performance principle with one in which reason is sensuous and sensuousness rational. Or even Norman Mailer's attempt during this period to what he calls rewire the central nervous system through jazz, Negro slang, and the uninhibited expression of male sexuality. That's in a really cool essay that Norman Mailer wrote called The White Negro. In short, the left called for more eros, more play, more art, sort of sex, drugs, rock and roll, all in response to a depoliticizing boredom. So acknowledging that misery and boredom still persist today, just as I would add anxiety subsists in the first and second waves, 6 Theses then identifies the key emotion today as anxiety, that ubiquitous, non-specific, kind of agitating hum in the background of everyday experience, which you feel is like a harbinger or possible harbinger, who can be sure, of a threat that's probably beyond my power anyway. So that's the sort of anxiety, this generalized anxiety. Lisa Hinrichsen, in a study of the role of anxiety in the poetry of Robert Frost, calls anxiety, quote, a nebulous affect, more sensed than sensible, indefinite in its origins and ends, psychically and spatially dislocated, and linguistically difficult to describe. Freud offers a more physiological definition. He writes, the name anxiety, which in Latin is angustia, means narrowness. It emphasizes the characteristic tightening of the breath. Now, if you broaden this definition, we could think of anxiety as a constriction of all of our sense organs, a constriction of the conduits between our inside and the outside. Anxious, we have to strain to see what's out there, and our reception of the scene is thus distorted. One result is an exaggerated sense of danger, which makes fight or flight seem the only options. Anxiety, in other words, is not conducive to subtle or inventive forms of political action or courageous intervention. Now, Sixth Theses calls upon the left to make anxiety one of its targets. The first step here is to publicize the actual political sources of what is experienced as a personal psychological condition, or tends to be experienced that way. Anxiety is said to be induced and sustained by, quote, an omnipresent web of surveillance techniques, by the relentless narrative that, quote, we need more stress so as to keep us safe and competitive. The Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which was written in the wake of Occupy Wall Street, they name another engine of anxiety, which is a financial establishment that, quote, first colludes with the government to create rules designed to put everyone in debt and then systematically extracts debt from you, end quote. Attention might also be drawn to what the ecologist Thomas Princeton calls the treadmill of production and consumption, which, in the name of growth, renders everything and everybody always on the way to obsolescence, essentially sort of trash in the making. Now, a diagnosis of this neoliberal capitalism that includes consideration of affect or emotions also sheds new light on the insurrectionist or revolutionary model of militancy often invoked by the left. That's part of the claim of these Sixth Theses people. Insofar as that model assumes that the most potent form of political action is direct, dramatic, and explosive, it relies upon what they call a deliberate exposure to high anxiety situations. But in a context where anxiety is already a well-functioning part of a capitalist machine, and where ordinary people are already worn down by continuous red alerts, both overt and insinuated, this model of militancy may perversely work against the emergence of a stronger sense of empowerment on the part of ordinary people. One strength, I think, of the Institute's manifesto is its very pragmatic claim that the oppositional tactics of the left need updating and enrichment. Unionization, strikes, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and revolutionary anger are important tactics, and they continue to be, but maybe we also need some new modes of resistance. Again, if the first wave of capitalism provoked, quote, a machine for fighting anxiety, and the second wave a machine for fighting boredom, what we might need now is a machine for fighting anxiety, end quote. Enter Leaves of Grass, which Whitman yielded, I'm going to contend, as a weapon in the fight against the public anxiety of his time. This was an anxiety about civil war, with its severed limbs, infected wounds, and persisting trauma. In preparation, I did that PBS series on the Civil War, Burns, right? And it was just a horrible, violent, bloody, a lot of severed limbs and infected wounds. So Whitman was in that time. The public anxiety had to do with civil war. It was an anxiety of whites who found it harder and harder to deny that America was organized around the misery of black slavery. This was an anxiety that prevented many ordinary people during the time from even imagining how one could forge another basis for social and economic life without having to go through the cruelty and horror of war. Whitman's was also a white working class anxiety about the rise of what he called the moneyed class that was smothering what he saw as the egalitarian potential of free enterprise. Now, it wasn't Whitman's style to foreground his personal anxiety or its public sources. But in one poem, which never made it to the final edition of Leaves of Grass, called the Poem of the Propositions of Nakedness, in that poem, he does allow his anxiety to surface. Let freedom prove no man's inalienable right. It's got like a sarcastic tone, which is very unlike Whitman's usual tone. Everyone who can tyrannize, let him tyrannize to his satisfaction. Let there be money, business, railroads, imports, exports, custom, authority, precedence, pallor, dyspepsia, smut, ignorance, unbelief. Let all the men of these states stand aside for a few smoochers. Let the few seize on what they choose. Let the rest gawk, giggle, starve, obey. Let the white person tread the black person under his heel. Now, Whitman here expresses doubts about the entire American experiment, departing from what's is called his usual, quote, strategy of future idealizing and universal sympathy. I see Whitman's attempt to induce a sharper and deeper experience of sympathy in the bodies of white Americans through his poetry as part of an attempt to turn a debilitating and privatizing anxiety into some other, more productive and empowering affect. This turning is a kind of alchemy. The high alert sensory agitation of anxiety is to be reshaped into a high alert sensory discernment of resemblances between bodies. So from anxiety to sympathy, but drawing upon some of its intensity. In stealing some of anxiety's fire, sympathy might become a more formidable competitor to it. Leaves of Grass, I think, seeks to inject into public life a stronger dose of sympathy, to function, Whitman said, as a kind of social glue that was strong enough to begin to tack back together a country of diverse inhabitants recently rent by civil war. Whitman's insights into the political efficacy of sympathy remain instructive today, whether one seeks a way around capitalism or, as Whitman himself did, one seeks a more democratic, egalitarian version of it. To understand the how of Whitman's transmutation of anxiety into sympathy through the poetry would require a careful study of the poetics of Leaves of Grass, which I'm not really going to do here. I'm not going to do that except to make a few brief comments. One, I note that the poems often do their work by harnessing the power of what Whitman sometimes calls doting. The poems pay inordinate attention to ordinary, everyday things. He dotes on them. The little one who sleeps in its cradle, the blab of the pave, the slough of boot soles, the suicide who sprawls on the bloody floor. And indeed, when I leave reading the Leaves of Grass, I too have often found myself more sensuously present to the lilies growing by the side of the road, or the traffic, the sound of traffic, or the blab of the pave, and to the slough of the boot soles and distant gaze of the homeless man who regularly approaches the open window of my car at this one intersection. So the poems seem to enhance my capacity to discern the sort of multiple overlapping and knotted strings that tie me and us to so many other bodies, large and small. Now, Whitman himself invokes the verb to dote in these lines. I don't have those lines. From Song of Myself. I dote on myself. There is that lot of me and all so luscious. Each moment and whatever happens thrills me with joy. I cannot tell how my ankles bend, nor whence the cause of my faintest wish, nor the cause of the friendship I emit, nor the cause of the friendship I take up again. That I walk up my stoop, I pause to consider if it really be. A morning glory at my window satisfies me more than the metaphysics of books. Now, some have read Whitman's doting as narcissistic. Perhaps that is one element, but the sights of his doting include not only his own ankles and his own wishes, but, quote, each moment and whatever happens, the front steps, the common plants. Whitman's famous use of catalogs in the poems, these long lists, is also relevant, I think, when you're thinking about the sort of the how of his transmutation of anxiety into sympathy. The carefully formulated namings he names, work to prime the reader's receptivity to the startlingly vital presence of every ordinary thing or object. George Kateb has described this as Whitman's attempt to alert us to the beauty that any person or thing has just by being there, or has just by force of wanting to be looked at rather than turned away from. Now, it was because I wanted to know more about how Leaves of Grass could trigger this kind of sympathy, which helped me respond to the daily news of violence, misery, injustice, and planetary ruin in a way that was a little bit less governed by anxiety, despair, or fatalism, that I began to study its various invocations in Whitman's writings. And so in what follows, and as a kind of preparation for a study of the poetics of the Leaves, I'm going to analyze the philosophical content of Whitman's many and various invocations of sympathy. Here's the outline. So what I've done so far is sort of talk about public anxiety to sort of set up what's sort of politically or potentially politically relevant about Whitman's use and experimentation with sympathy in the poems. And now I'm going to turn to the 5 varieties of sympathy that I've sort of found in his writings in the poetry. I've named them such, and then at the end I'm going to return back to that first theme about the relationship between anxiety and sympathy. Okay, so the 5 figures of sympathy range from sympathy as a distinctively human sentiment to sympathy as something more, let's call it trans-individual. It's like a cosmic tendency, which he likens to gravity, right? So it's going to go from the personal to the more impersonal. If leaves of grass copes with anxiety by attempting to inflect it into sympathy, that new affect, it comes in several different varieties, models, or flavors for Whitman. And I'm going to address each of these before returning in the conclusion to the theme of the affective element of politics. Okay, sympathy number 1, let's call it sentimental. Especially in Whitman's early writings, he worked with what might be called a sentimental model of sympathy, and I don't mean that in the disparaging sense of soppy or cloying, but sentimental as marking, let's call it a quality of having or appealing to tender feelings. So a sensitivity, right? You have and you appeal, and the scene appeals to your tender feelings. This is when one person who's currently in a position of greater fortune, talent, happiness, health, moral fortitude, or social power allows herself to co-feel the suffering, misfortune, or disadvantage of another. It's like the normal notion of sympathy. Sentimental sympathy is akin to what Rousseau had described as pity or compassion, which he called one of the first and simplest operations of the human soul, which, quote, hurries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see in distress, like a natural tendency. Now, Whitman speaks of being infused with, quote, floods of love for our humankind, that strange, indescribable sympathy with all suffering, crime, ignorance, deformity, end quote. Now, this first figure of sympathy restricts the parties of the sympathetic relation to human persons. And these are human persons conceived as possessing a natural capacity for pity. And this first model of sympathy, or first flavor of sympathy, focuses on scenes of suffering. Okay. This is a humanist and emotional model. It entailed for Whitman, as it did for Rousseau, actually not just a relationship between two human persons, it almost always in this mode referred to a third divine person, Jesus. The divine person of Jesus always was hovering in the background, whose infinite love and mercy served as the prototype for human compassion. So tender feeling sympathy is often also gendered female by Whitman, and there's many places where we could cite where he says things like that. One in the poem called Poem of Women, he speaks of unfolded out of the sympathy of the woman is all sympathy. Now, other scholars have shown how Whitman's editorials of the 1840s, before he became a poet, he was a newspaper man for the Brooklyn Eagle on Long Island, and his early editorials, he took up a very strong campaign against capital punishment in New York State, and we're talking 1840s, and it relied heavily upon a sentimental model of sympathy. And when he was accused of sentimentalism and mawkish sympathy by people who wrote into the newspaper in response to his editorials, Whitman responded simply by affirming the epithets and reminding his critics of the divine mercy of Jesus, so appealing to a Christian audience. He writes, "Who are we to pity, if not those most pitiable of all our fellow creatures, the doers of great crimes? If it be mawkish sympathy to think so, then so was the great expiator of sin, the weakest and wildest visionary of us all." Whitman also says, by 1855, New York State had not abolished capital punishment, but Whitman writes in his diary, the anti-gallows movement had nevertheless increased and diffused the benevolence, sympathy, and sensitiveness on the part of the public, end quote. Now, the locus of tender sympathy is what Whitman sometimes calls soul, but soul understood in good Emersonian fashion as operating simultaneously within the individual and in the cosmos. So soul was not like purely localizable into any person. Whitman's transcendentalism here is not far from what Henri Bergson said, this: the matter and life which fill the world are equally within us. The forces which work in all things we feel within ourselves, whatever may be the inner essence of what is and what is done, we are of that essence. So I'm trying to get this sort of, I'm bringing out this sort of transcendentalism, that what's in here is also out there, and this sort of, not exactly perfect doubling, but multiple sites. Because as Whitman, as I go through these 5 notions of sympathy, it's going to become more and more cosmic. Right. Okay. Whitman assigns to the poet the task of forming the right consistence of soul. This entails an artistic balancing of 2 naturally occurring sentiments, he says, an other-oriented sentiment of sympathy and an ego-oriented sentiment of pride. And that is what he says there about that. Without effort and without exposing in the least how it is done, because this is one of the tactics of how you transmute anxiety into sympathy, is you don't do it overtly. You don't announce what you're doing, without exposing in the least how it is done. The greatest poet brings the spirit of any or all events and passions to bear on your individual character as you hear or read. The greatest poet forms the consistence of what is to be from what has been and is. He doesn't moralize. He knows the soul. The soul has that measureless pride which consists in never acknowledging any lessons but its own, but it also has sympathy. Sympathy, balance, you got to try to work with both of these. I wish that he had said, instead of pride, I wish he had said anxiety, but he wasn't fully on my wavelength here, so I have to, Okay. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which the character Eva, quote, physically weakens when the suffering of slaves sunk into her heart, end quote, that was like the prototypical example of the time of sentimental or tender feelings model of sympathy, one in which, to again invoke Bergson, a person is, quote, transported into the interior of an object in order to coincide with what there is unique and consequently inexpressible in it. So it's this sort of sense that you get on the inside and then look from the inside out. Okay, like Whitman's anti-Gallo writings, the logic of Stowe's tale announces a shared humanity across differences of class, fortune, race, or luck, even as it also depends upon a hierarchy that positions the sympathizer as the subject and the person with whom you're being sympathetic is the object. So it's hierarchical there. Still, Stowe and Whitman don't want to get rid of this first sentimental model of sympathy, despite that. Because they believe that sympathy would, in the end, even sentimental sympathy, would have a leveling effect. The vicarious experience of another person's pain, experienced from the vantage point of social and moral superiority, would soon then be translated by the sympathizer's own body into a more directly experienced, in a kind of mimesis, first-hand pain, and then the sympathizer would be more powerfully motivated to eliminate the social sources of the suffering or harm. That's sort of the logic they're hoping for. Like, because of the way body transfers happen, when you sympathize with someone else, you feel that you don't just imagine their pain, you feel it, and then it becomes first-hand pain, and you don't want to be in pain, so that motivates you to do something, or at least that was the idea there. So tender feeling sympathy would have its strongest political impact upon readers already imbued with the temperament of the Christian reformer, and I think the Christian reformer is the predecessor both to today's bleeding heart liberals, that's what I am, and the and the attentator, which is the person who Emma Goldman writes about in Anarchism and other essays. She writes about the person who's motivated, it's like the person who's the word I'm trying to think of, the person who tried to assassinate McKinley. They're so sensitive in nature. They're so high-strung, like a violin string, that his or her deep sympathy with human suffering compels each to, quote, close the chapter of their lives with a violent outbreak against our system. So it's this sentimental sympathy. Insofar as it works, it probably works, what I'm trying to say, on a sort of subset of temperamental types, right? But Whitman also offers other figures of sympathy. With target audiences that are potentially broader. Okay, I'm going to move to the next one. The next kind of sympathy is that you find in Whitman is one I'm calling sympathy of bodily shape. Oh no, yeah, don't read that one just yet. Okay, sympathy as bodily shape. Sympathy appears as a shape or organ of the human body, and so it's no longer like identification. Psychological identification no longer a factor. And he writes in I Sing the Body Electric, all attitudes, all the shapeliness, all the belongings of my or your body or anyone's body, male or female, the lung sponges, the stomach sacs, the bowels sweet and clean, the brain in its folds inside the skull frame, sympathies, heart valves, palate valves, sexuality, maternity. So he mixes them all up, bodily organs and sympathy. Whitman seems here to be trying, I think, to articulate a sympathy that's less tethered to the frame of Christian morality and pity, one that's more decidedly spatial and fleshy than that captured by the notion of sentiment. Sympathies appears on his list that includes biological organs and functions. A sympathy is one of the attitudes, styles, or shapes that a body can take. Elsewhere in this notebook, he experiments with a weirder and more grosser image but it's more physicalist notion or figure of sympathy. As an unborn fetus lodged in an autopsied brain, where does the train of truth? See? So, among murderers and cannibals and traitors and slaves, stopped my spirit with light feet and cried among their heads and made fissures to look through. Even so, these murderers and cannibals, the worst of humanity, he made a fissure through their skull, and in there he saw folded fetuses of twins, mute with bent necks, waiting to be born. One was sympathy and one was truth. So in this figure, you kind of, it's a rather gruesome image of entwined fetuses exposed to view by a hole in the skull. I think he's trying to mark a kind of universal, even if buried, physical presence of sympathy. Sympathy comes with all human bodies, even that of cannibals, as regularly as do its other biological organs. It is a latent animal function. That was a notebook, never made into the poems. Okay, third kind of sympathy I'm calling the yes of nature. And what we're starting to see now is how he's starting to articulate a notion of sympathy, that's really becoming detached from the human individual. And now, at this point, it's going to be lodged more in this thing called nature. Okay. Invocations of sentimental sympathy can be found throughout Whitman's poetry and prose. They never go away. And like him, I too find that notion to have some political efficacy that ought not to be disparaged. Still, even in the passages where Whitman evokes a personal feeling of pity, there's a certain tendency for the sight of that sympathetic energy to spread or ooze out beyond persons, to include non-human entities or bodies, especially those found in nature. We can see this happening in an early story that Whitman wrote called One Wicked Impulse. It's like a melodrama. It's a tale of Philip, a guy who has killed a lawyer who cheated him and his sister out of their inheritance and has sexually assaulted this sister. So the lawyer is a bad guy. Philip kills the bad guy. And although he's acquitted, Philip remains plagued with guilt at the murder. But one day, however, he awakens to find himself calmed by the gleam of the Hudson River, by the flowers and grass and noble trees, and he comes to experience an unconditional acceptance. Another notion of sympathy. You can read it there. And you see what happens is, no accusing frown showed in the face of the flowers. He bent over, that's not Philip, but that's now he takes the roses into his hands, and the roses don't recoil at his murderous deed, and he experiences sympathy. Okay. Now what begins to appear here is a flavor of sympathy, or a figure of sympathy, that yields not so much pity as a more neutral, though no less intense mood. Let's call it acceptance, akin to what Whitman elsewhere calls the universal and affectionate yes of the earth. So I'm calling this model of sympathy yes, yes exclamation point. For when the locus of sympathy starts to overflow the form of the person, it also starts to detach from the affect of pity. It's not quite accurate then to say that the Roses or the Hudson feel sorry for Philip's suffering. It's not the sentimental. It's not like they have human sentiments. Right? Rather, they take him aboard, accept him without judgment as a body not in need of pity, mercy, pardon, or redemption. Nature, in the words of another poem called By Blue Ontario Shore, judges not as the judge judges, but as the sun falling around a helpless thing, which is not really judging at all, it's just acceptance. Right? So you can kind of again see the Christian background thing about judge not in the New Testament. This solar judging is open-armed, impartial, elemental, a nonchalant acceptance. Now one can also discern the drift from a sentimental to a less personal and less moralistic yes model of sympathy by tracing Whitman's use of the phrase, a curious kind of sympathy. Now, maybe this is too detailed here, but the phrase, a curious kind of sympathy, shows up 3 times in Whitman's work. The first time it shows up, it's, and these are chronological in years. The first time it shows up, he's talking about what you would think of as regular old mind-to-mind sympathy, person-to-person suffering. Right. It's a curious kind of sympathy. He's talking about himself as a newspaper man, and he loves the public. You get this one, okay. Now, that's what the first time. The second time it appears in the poem Enfant d'Adam number 3. The sight of this curious sympathy has now migrated from mind to hand, and you're sort of seeing him become less spiritualist and more materialist. Right? And the parties now include a body's naked meat. So again, he's got the list of the body parts, and then the curious sympathy one feels, it's no longer mind to mind, but now it's hand to meat to personal body, but the meat of a personal body. The curious sympathy one feels when feeling with the hand the naked meat of his own body or another person's body. So now you've got this sort of, I don't know what, you see the shift in metaphors there. Now the last time the phrase appears, it's 1891, and now he's dropped the thing about one's body. It's just the body. So it's getting even more impersonal. So the locus or the site or the objects of sympathetic encounter become less and less personal. From, sympathy becomes more now like an electrical current passing between bodies, and the scene of sympathy has become even less dependent upon a sentimental human self. And that's the drift. All right, the next kind of sympathy, the fourth model or figure of sympathy, is erotic. The terms sympathy and love are closely aligned in Whitman's writing, sometimes to the point of synonym. When he says, we know that sympathy or love is the law over all laws. Now Whitman tends to use the word love on those occasions when the sympathy he wants to mark, or the attraction he wants to mark, is between bodies and it's a particularly pleasurable. Where tender leaning towards another approaches the full-on sexual merge, that's his word for it. That dangerous and thrilling abdication of individual identity in order to enter into the other body by commingling fluids or flesh, or sometimes eating. And the interesting thing here about this sort of erotic sympathy is that it's not restricted to people. He writes, just to give you a sense of this merge, who need be afraid of the merge? Oh, adhesiveness. Oh, the pensive aching to be together. You know not why, and I know not why. So it's this total, union. Scholars have connected Whitman's erotic poetry to antebellum debates about free love and women's rights. Other scholars, such as James Martell and Jason Frank, have argued that eros has political as well as sexual reach for Whitman. I'm not going to talk about that. But what is noteworthy to me is the fact that the parties to the erotic sympathy don't even have to be human bodies. This is my best slide. Now, this is when he talks about, these are all examples of erotic sympathies. The first one is a relationship between a body that's an I, or a person, and another one. Oh, adhesiveness, that's what I just read. But then he also has examples of an erotic kind of sympathy, and this is getting, again, it's moving away from a human-centric model of sympathy. That's where I'm going. He says, the press of my foot to the earth springs 100 affections. So, right, there's this sort of connection there, foot to ground. You can have an erotic sympathy with your hamburger. Who goes there, hankering, gross, mystical, nude? How is it I extract strength from the beef I eat? And if you put that in the context, it has to do with this attraction. But then even this, even less personal version, matter to matter. I am he that aches with amorous love. Does the earth, but then notice the next phrase, right? Does the earth gravitate? So how did you move from amorous love to the earth gravitating? Does not all matter attract all matter? So the body of me to all I meet or know. So you see how this personal thing is an expression of this much broader thing. Okay. In expanding the sites and generative flows of eros and in presenting sympathy for fellow humans as part of a series in which bodies of all kinds can be susceptible to effective contagion with each other, Whitman begins to articulate the last variety of sympathy that I'm going to talk about. It's the gravitational. Now, the model of sentimental sympathy, I'm just going to review, depicts a human person co-feeling the suffering of others in imitation of Christ's ultimate act of sympathy. Now, as Whitman comes to understand this divineness, or this divine embrace, in more and more naturalistic terms, there appear in his writings the three other figures of sympathy that I've named. A shapely sympathy construed less as a virtuous practice than as a physical organ or growth within the body. A yes sympathy exemplified by nature's acceptance of all things and persons with equanimity, no judgment. And an erotic sympathy aimed at the pleasurable merge between bodies, human and not, including the foot to the ground. Right? Now, Whitman takes, I think, yet another step away from this anthropocentrism of the very first model when he speaks of sympathy akin to the even more impersonal force of gravity. So we're not even talking Mother Nature anymore, it's just like cosmic force, gravity. Like the yes model of sympathy, or figure of sympathy, gravitational sympathy does not discriminate, he writes. Does the light or heat pick out? Does the attraction of gravity pick out? No, it does not. But gravity is more inexorable than the great Mother Nature's yes. Inexorable, that's the... Gravity is strong and relentless, a force that always must be reckoned with. So he's got this uniting a little bit of strife in that. It is not within human power to conquer gravity. And when Whitman likens sympathy to gravity, it is to mark the ontological depth of sympathy. To mark, that is, the resilient and relentless agency of sympathy that is at work even within a society riven by hatred and civil war. It's still there. It is a terrible and irrepressible yearning, this never-satisfied appetite for sympathy, and this boundless offering of sympathy, this old, eternal, yet ever-new exchange of adhesiveness. Now, gravitational sympathy is a tendency not of individuals or human societies even, but of a dynamic universe. It is what I've elsewhere described as ontosympathy. So any socially inflected experience of tenderness, pity, affirmation, or eros on the part of an individual now appears as a partial and reductive expression of this unwilled cosmic tendency. To posit sympathy as an ontological reality is not to say that it's always going to carry the day or that sympathy is always going to win out. Because there's a lot of other things that happen, and surely also sympathy competes with other cosmic tendencies, including perhaps antipathy or strife, but I'm not talking about that. Sympathy has, Whitman here insists, nonetheless, a reality that's independent of people. Now, you can call it divine, you can link it up with God, you can link it up with nature that's designed, but you don't even have to for him. It kind of moves in that direction to like at the level of gravity. If Whitman had the Deleuzian vocabulary for it, he might have said that sympathy is a virtual affect, a pre-personal or trans-individual intensity that might sometimes get translated into emotion. So you get this affect, and it gets this vague thing, that translated into emotion in people. Poetry may help us become slightly more attuned to that intensity, more sensitized to it, and then we might become more sensitive to other bodies, including other people, but other natural bodies, or nature, or even technological objects. Okay, have we come full circle back to sentimental sympathy, to one individual's tender feelings for another? Not quite. Because now, once you've gone through all this thinking about these various models of sympathy, the self and the other have now become something a little different than individuals. Maybe they're not so much individuals as individuations of a vast and elemental cosmic process. So, this all-connectedness thing. Whitman here opens the door, I think, to contemporary forays into sort of distributed notions of agency, or agency that's like the site of agency. Whenever effects are produced, we tend to think it's just human intentions and stuff, but there are other notions of agency that it's distributed in objects and forces and across various bodies. And I think Whitman, by sort of, what I've tried to do is go through these different flavors of sympathy, because I think at the end, when he gets to gravitational sympathy, he's sort of almost there with what contemporary theorists are thinking about as more distributed notions of agency, and also things that people are doing in process philosophy with Whitehead and Karen Barad, her feminist materialisms, etc. Okay, let me close by returning to the question of the value of sympathy within a political context of high anxiety. Okay, so just to recall, just in case you forgot, we live in a society, I'm saying, that's ceaselessly induced to feel anxious. We're ceaselessly induced to feel anxious by the news and entertainment media, by government announcements, terror alerts, by extensive surveillance, NSA stuff, by disciplinary systems, police presence, by pharmaceutical companies hawking their solutions to all of our anxiety. And also, I think, by such small things as what I've noticed is an emerging norm of compulsory exposure to TV being on. In airports, bars, buses, waiting rooms, etc. So that first slide was, it gets snowed in up there, and it's, terror, security. Okay. Now this anxiety, I think, does tend to debilitate the will to engage in political action. And the ubiquity of these techniques of anxiety inducement may help to explain why there's so little outrage, though there's not no outrage, at policies that redistribute wealth ever upward and push us steadily towards global environmental collapse. It's not the whole story, but it can't be helping. Getting sort of up the will and the courage and energy to do something about that. Whitman uses his poetry, I think, to induce a stronger sense of sympathy, a sympathy that he hopes will divert the affective flows that might otherwise be channeled into anxiety. Now, did the Institute for Precarious Consciousness, that I got this idea about 6 theses on anxiety, did they choose the figure of a machine for fighting anxiety? The left needs to build a machine for fighting anxiety. Did they choose that metaphor in order, perhaps, because of its martial overtones? In order, that is, to proclaim that the left, too, can be a strong, resolute, and militant force rather than merely merciful, tolerant, or loving. So you've got sort of a masculine strength, as opposed. That's usually associated with the right. But so we need a machine for fighting anxiety. And I think that makes some political sense. But a war against anxiety might also suggest, mistakenly, I think, that anxiety can be conquered, vanished, that you can live without anxiety. Perhaps more promising is the quest to inflect anxiety into something else, to practice what I'm trying to call like an alchemy of anxiety, try to transmute or inflect one thing into another, that thing about drawing upon the high anxiety intensity, a high intensity alertness of anxiety into some high alertness sensitivity of sympathy. And I think that's what Music Grass seeks to do, to transmute anxiety. Occasionally he tries to transmute it into righteous sarcasm, as in the poem Opposites to Nakedness. Occasionally Whitman tries to transmute it into like overt political critique. I didn't give you examples of that. but he wrote basically a manifesto called, Against the 18th Presidency. But most often Whitman tries to transmute, I'm arguing, anxiety into sympathy. And it's a sympathy that operates simultaneously at the personal, the natural, and the cosmic levels. And I guess I'm suggesting that alchemy would also be a good thing for political life today. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening.